Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Learning Photography. In this episode, we're going to explore the ways that the components of the exposure triangle that we talked about in episode 4, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, how each of those components affect the outcome of your image. What actually shows up as a result of your having taken or made an image. We ended last episode talking about ISO and how it affected the resolution of the image, the quality of the image. So we'll just do a real quick review of that. If you'll see here on the chart, we have a low ISO of 100 on some cameras. My Olympus camera, most Olympus cameras have 200 as their native ISO. Through 400, 800, remember it's 2 times 2 times, that's a full stop. So from 200 to 400 is a full stop, just as we talked about with aperture and shutter speed. 800 all the way up. And some cameras will go even beyond 12,800 ISO. And at the low end, where you have a low value of an ISO, your image resolution is going to be the best quality because you have bright ambient light and you don't need to make your sensor more sensitive than it's really intended to be. But as you go towards higher ISOs and it gets darker outside, there's less ambient light, then you start to have some degradation in the resolution of the image. And that shows up when you get really to higher ISOs. On older cameras, 1600 and 3200 were pretty much the cap. On newer cameras, 6400, 12800, and twice that and beyond are now rendered fairly decently. But still, as you look at the dark areas of your image, the shadow areas of an image, or if it's a really overall dark image, you're going to find digital noise. And that, we said, was the modern version of grain. So that's how ISO, choosing a specific ISO, affects the outcome of your image. And that's why we always try to stay at the native or the base ISO that your camera has. By doing so, we can always increase the ISO, but we use that, as I say, as a wild card. If we can't get shutter speed and aperture to help us get a good exposure, then we resort to the higher ISOs. Okay, so that's ISO. Here's a quick illustration of digital noise. I took these with my iPhone 7. So this first one is an image shot at a low ISO of like 250. The second image was shot at 1600 ISO. Notice the digital noise, all the little spots. But let's today address aperture and shutter speed and how choosing one of them as a priority affects your image. So aperture, as we said, is a function of how much, or the quantity of light that enters your camera's lens. And so that's governed by how big the aperture is. So if we look at a very small aperture, and remember each full stop aperture is twice as big as the one before it. And so they're doubling, each time they're doubling the quantity of light that's allowed through the lens. And as we get to a larger hole and a smaller aperture value number, so if this is f.2, or f2 rather, and this is f2.8, and this is f4, remember? 2 times 2 is 4. Every other one is going to be double the one not the one before it. And 2.8 to 2 is one full stop. So we go f4, and then the next smallest hole is, I'm just going to put the number, 5.6, and then 8. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 2.8 is 5.6. 2 times 5.6 is 11.2, but it's really 11. And if we go even smaller, it's 16. So let's, for purposes of our illustration, that's our range of aperture values. And as the number gets smaller, the hole gets bigger. So what does aperture actually control? What does it affect in the outcome of your image? And what this is called depth of field. So we abbreviate it depth of field, standing for depth of field. If we draw a little illustration, basically it's, let's say that we are, here's the camera, and here is a tree. And some grass. And here is our subject standing before the tree. I told you before, I'm not an artist. So there's our subject. And as we take a shot of our subject, we have to decide, do we want the tree to be in perfect focus? And if we do, then we want, so let's say, the tree to in front of our subject to be in focus. That whole area right there is what we want in focus. That is the depth of field. And when we want a little bit in front of our subject, all the way back behind our subject to be in focus, we want a deeper depth of field. And to do that, we choose an aperture with a small hole. So usually you're good and safe with using f8 or f11 in a situation like this. And that is the reason that if you ask a photographer, how do you usually shoot your pictures? They'll say, I shoot an aperture priority. That means they're giving priority to the aperture. They want to set the aperture because they want to affect the depth of field in the resulting image. And so they'll use that particular setting on their mode dial. And so if they set their aperture to f11 or f8, they're fairly assured of getting all of this in focus, a rather deep depth of field. However, if what they want is a really, really sharp image of the subject, this person standing right here, and they want the tree to be a little fuzzy, or maybe, and another reason for doing this is maybe behind the subject is a parking lot with a lot of cars, and you just want to blur that. Well, then that's when you want to choose a shallow depth of field, so that from here in front of the subject to just maybe beyond the subject is what is in real focus. So with a shallow depth of field, they're going to use a larger opening. With a deep depth of field as a desired result, they're going to choose a much smaller opening or aperture value. That is to say, an aperture opening, the number is going to be larger. Because remember, the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. I like to think, an analogy that I give, and Silverina is really the one who gave me this idea, I like to use the analogy of a pool. So if we have a swimming pool, let's make this be a swimming pool down here. And here's the diving board here. And here is kind of the waiting area of the pool. So this is the depth of the water here is 2 feet. The depth of the water by the diving board is 16 feet, so that you have lots of room to dive into. And this is referred to as the deep end of the pool, is it not? Deep. However, this is referred to as the shallow end of the pool. So an aperture of 2.0 renders a shallow depth of field. An aperture of 16 renders a deep depth of field. A lot in focus, shallow depth of field, not so much in focus. And when you get really close to your subject and take a shot and you focused on their eyes, which is where you should always focus with people, you focus on their eyes and you have a really shallow depth of field because of an aperture opening like f2 or even 1.8 or 1.4, then it's possible their ears won't even be in focus because you're focusing on the eyes, and so the nose is going to be in focus, and maybe, normally somebody is tilted a little bit when they're doing a portrait. The one ear might be in focus, but this ear won't. And so that's a really shallow depth of field. And so that's why we choose to prioritize aperture, because we're looking for a really shallow depth of field. All right, let's demonstrate how we achieve different depths of field using aperture as our prioritized control. So I have my camera set in manual mode. Even though there's an aperture priority mode, for these exercises I suggest you work in manual. And if you can go outside, I suggest you go outside. If it's weather's decent, we happen to be having some incredibly decent weather, warm weather for February. And where I am sitting now in our yard, it's kind of shady, so I have to up my ISO a little bit, because remember, if there's not a whole lot of light, you increase your ISO to get more light. And I'm doing that. I'm doing that on my EM1, which is what I'm going to take the pictures with, because I want to be able to use a very, very small aperture opening, like an f11 or f16. Remember, that small hole is a big number compared to the other end of the scale, where a small number like 2.8 or 2 is a big hole and creates a shallow depth of field. So I've got my camera set to f11, and that's a small hole. So I'm going to get lots of depth, or a lot more depth of field than I would at the other end of the spectrum. So I've got 3 Coke bottles here, and they're spaced at an angle from me and from you. And I'm going to take a picture of the first bottle, focus on that, but see all 3 bottles. And when I'm using f11, we would expect all 3 bottles to be in focus. So let's try that. Focusing on the front bottle, I've got my camera at f11, and I'm using a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and my camera is telling me that I'm about a third of a stop underexposed, but that's okay for here. For this demonstration, so I've got the first bottle. Okay, now I'm going to the second bottle, the third bottle. Focusing on that, taking a picture of all 3. And what you should see in the demonstration picture, all 3 bottles look somewhat equally in focus, even though the focus, that second image, was on the third bottle. Okay, let's go the other way around now. Let's go to the other. I have a lens that happens to support 2.8, an aperture of 2.8. So I'm going to dial back from f11 to 2.8. And every stop is 3 clicks. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm at f8, and so on. So I'll keep going until I get to 2.8, f4, then 1, 2, 3, 2.8. So that's a full stop. Now I'm letting a lot more light in now, and my shutter speed before was 1/60th of a second. So in order to get a correct exposure, quantity of light wise, I need to speed up my shutter speed. So I'll let the camera help me do that as I look through the lens. So I'm focusing on the front bottle. It's telling me I'm 3 stops overexposed. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and now I'm at 1/125th of a second. 1, 2, 3, and I'm 1/250th of a second. 1, 2, 3, and I'm 1/500th of a second. It's still telling me that I'm a little overexposed. So I'm a little bit further. I'm actually going to underexpose by 1, and I'm now at 1/1000. Okay, so I'm focused on the front bottle. Now take a look at that picture. The front bottle is in focus. The second bottle is sort of in focus. The third bottle is a little fuzzy. So now I'm going to focus on the third bottle. shot. Same settings, f2.8, 1/1000th of a second, ISO of 800 because of the shady area. Take the shot. Take a look at that. The third bottle now is in focus, and the first bottle is fuzzy. That's depth of field. Okay, so now let's take a look at why we would choose to prioritize shutter speed. And again, shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds. And so whereas aperture is controlling the quantity of light that comes in through the lens, and ISO is controlling the sensitivity of the sensor that receives the light to register an image, shutter speed is controlling the time that the light has to actually hit the sensor. And so how quickly or slowly the shutter opens and closes. And it is a curtain. It goes up, down, and how fast it does that is shutter speed. So as we said, shutter speed is a fraction of a second. And so if we go from where we want to get a lot of light because we want a slow shutter speed, let's start at 1/2 a second. So 1/2 of a second. 1/4 of a second is twice as fast as 1/2 a second. 1/8 of a second is twice as fast as that. And it actually is not 16, it's going to be 1/15th of a second. And then 1/30th of a second. 1/60th of a second. And that is the slow rate, from the slow to a moderate shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. And remember in last episode I mentioned that 1/60th of a second is what I consider normal and what most people can handhold without any support a camera and still get a steady picture with no blur because of movement, or camera blur as we call that. So we go beyond 1/60th and it is 1/125. Again, not a perfect math calculation. And 1/250, which is 2 times 125, and 1/500, and so on. And most cameras will go as high as 1/4000, 1/4000th of a second. That is super fast. That shutter curtain is opening and closing so quickly, it's a bat of an eye, and even greater than that. Newer cameras have 1/8000th of a second. Some have incorporated a digital shutter speed at 16,000ths of a second. Incredibly fast. So why would we choose to prioritize shutter speed? Shutter speed, a slow shutter speed, results in allowing any movement that's in the image. If somebody's running across the frame or children are playing around in the frame, their movement is going to be blurs. They're going to be blurred. You're not even going to be able to see who they are, really. So a slow shutter speed will give you blur. And if you want to freeze them, you've got maybe your son, your grandson, or granddaughter is running down the field on the soccer field or lacrosse field, and you want to freeze them because they're cradling the ball or they've got control of the ball, and you use a fast shutter speed to freeze their action. You don't want a blur. You want it to be frozen. But creatively, you might want a little bit of a blur, so you slow down the shutter speed. And so that's how you use shutter speed creatively. You use a slow shutter speed to cause blur, or to have blur registered on the sensor, or you use a fast shutter speed because you want to stop the action. Somebody putting a basket into the net. You want to see that frozen, and that would be a fast shutter speed. So that's why you choose shutter speed as a way to control the outcome of your image, and that's what the effect is if you choose a fast or slow shutter speed. Now we're going to take a look at what shutter speed affects. I've got a fan running. You can hear it, I'm sure. Hopefully you can still hear me. And I've got my EM1, and again I've got it set to manual. And I have my shutter speed set at 1/30th of a second. That's not really slow shutter speed. It's slow, but it's not the slowest. But even at that relatively fast shutter speed, if you will, and an aperture of 2.8, although what we're looking at is shutter speed here, I'm going to take a shot of the fan spinning at high speed, and when you look at the resulting image, you can't see the blades. There are three blades. There are three blades on this fan, but you can't see them because the shutter speed was too slow to freeze them. Okay, so now I'm going to up my shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. Now I have to do some changes with my aperture so I have the right, and with my ISO really, because I'm already as the widest open aperture I have. So I'm having to change my ISO from ISO 200 to 800. And I'm at 1/125th of a second, and you can see blades, but you can't see the individual blades. So let's jump far up. Let's go to 1/2000 or 1/1000th of a second. And again, I'll have to change my ISO. Change it to 3200 ISO. Take a shot, and now we can start to see blades. Okay, we're getting there. So let's go to 1/2000th of a second. And again, I have to change my ISO. But because of what we're doing here, it doesn't really matter. I'm using a really high ISO. We're not worried about digital noise. We just want to see those blades. And there they are. You can see them at 1/2000. So let's go to 1/4000. A stop faster. And to up my ISO again. Let's see, ISO. Okay, here we go. Now you can see them even better. But that demonstrates the point that the faster the shutter speed, the more it freezes motion, even a fan that's running at high speed. Let's turn this fan off. And we'll take a normal shot back to 120 or 1/60th of a second will do, and we'll lower our ISO to, we should be able to go down to 400. That's perfect. So you can see what I'm talking about. So there's the fan not running, and there are the three blades. So that's how shutter speed affects motion in your images. Alright, hopefully this explanation and the illustrations of actually taking the camera outside or in the house, however I happen to have done that, and shown you these principles in practice has been helpful to you in internalizing what each of these controls, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, what these controls affect in your final images and why you choose one over another to prioritize. Again, there are tons of resources on the internet, and on YouTube, on blogs, on digitalphotographyschool.com is a great site that will give you additional information on what I've talked about today. And hopefully, as I said, the illustrations of actually applying these techniques has been somewhat useful to you. in the next episode, in episode 6, we're going to take these particular features, aperture control, shutter speed control, and ISO control, and see how we control them physically on the camera. In other words, what are the physical buttons and dials that we use on cameras to adjust these different variables. And we'll go beyond that. We'll talk about the other dials and buttons that are on your camera in episode 6. So thank you very much for watching this, and I hope it's been helpful to you. And if you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to your coming back and checking in on our next video. Thank you. Good day.